was
you haven't proven,
unreasonable
sorry to
for
go
him
around
to
this again,
use
but you
that
haven't
force.
proven that the officer didn't know that the gun had been removed.
You haven't proved that he did. And this
No, but
is
you're
where,
making
this is
a
where we're
judgment
arguing
call.
facts.
Before we jump in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and remember to like and subscribe. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. In this video, we're looking straight at something deeply unsettling. A clear glimpse into the authoritarian mindset being defended out loud. You're about to watch LBC's Tom Swarbrick go head-to-head with MAGA advocate Jenna Ellis, and what unfolds is more than just a disagreement. It's a justification framework that treats extreme state force as not just acceptable, but presumed. As this exchange plays out, you'll hear an argument that repeatedly shifts responsibility away from authority and onto the individual who ended up dead. Even when key facts are disputed, the language is careful, legalistic, and polished, but the implication underneath it is stark. If you're deemed confrontational, the presumption flips against you. This isn't about one incident or one panel discussion. It's about a worldview, one where accountability is optional and power is automatically assumed to be in the right. Watch the full exchange closely, because the logic being used here matters far beyond this one moment. I'll give my 2 cents at the end.
Jenna Ellis is a constitutional attorney, national radio host, and member of Trump's 2020 Advisory Board. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme, Jenna. Improvements do need to be made, don't they? I mean, that is an understatement.
Well, I think there's always room for improvement, but what this video clearly shows is that people rush to judgment for political preference, one side or the other, and you have to look at the entire context, not just some videos, or even as one of the Democrat senators on the Senate floor either yesterday or today was putting up this AI-generated photo of the altercation and the confrontation between Preddy and ICE. So we need to look at the facts. I think that Tom Homan, who's very experienced, even won an award under President Barack Obama, who is a Democrat, I think he needs to come in and enforce the border, but ensure that they're doing this in a way that minimizes these agitators' confrontations as swiftly as possible.
Minimizing the agitators' confrontation might involve not shooting them dead.
It depends on the context. I mean, if you're up in law enforcement's face and you are shouting obscenities like this and you have a loaded gun with you, then, well, that is police force, and what constitutes appropriate response is dependent on the circumstances. Some of these shootings absolutely are justified. And so what's the argument to say that he whether he deserves it or not is a moral question?
Do you think Mr. Pretty's shooting is justified?
I do, based on what we've seen. But I think that the facts are going to continue to come out. But I think that when you are an agitator and you choose, as is your constitutionally protected right, to take a gun to a protest, and then you get up in law enforcement's face, you refuse to back down of the situation. And when you look at the full context of the video, there was a gunshot that went out. There were people saying gun, gun. This is not something where they can go back and review the footage.
And it was removed from him by ICE officials. It was taken away from him, and he was shot and killed.
And you're seeing that in real time from the luxury of your studio. You are not on the ground as an ICE agent, not knowing what's going on. These officers are making split-second decisions.
It's a very difficult job, but they do those very difficult jobs. That is not a justification for shooting them dead to say it's a very difficult job.
Well, no, that's not the justification.
So
what is the justification? Is the fact that he was there with a gun, and the individual. Yes, but it's not his right to go and confront ICE, to not be submissive to law enforcement when they're saying that he's obstructing. And in the heat of the moment, they are making a judgment when he is already violating federal law through obstruction.
But do you think that judgment was right?
That's a risk.
I think it's a risk.
I think it was justified under the law. Do I think that he should have been there in the first place? No. Do I think that he obstructed the law and it is reasonable under the circumstances? That's the question, because what you're not asking, Tom, is what was his crime and what was his motivation to be there to begin with? Nobody is thinking that this was okay that this happened. Of course, everyone wishes that it hadn't. But what was reasonable under the circumstances for the officer's response is, of course, dependent on the circumstances. And I think given everything, it's reasonable.
Unless you've seen something that perhaps hasn't emerged yet. The man did not have a gun on him at the point at which the gun was removed from him by ICE agents. Yes, he had been confrontational to ICE agents. Yes, he had kicked, it seems this video shows he'd kicked the car and had resisted arrest. And I don't know whether this is a bit of a cultural difference between America and Britain. But in Britain, that would absolutely, under no circumstances, constitute someone being shot dead by police.
Do you know for a fact that the officer who shot was aware that the gun had been removed and that the other officer saying gun did not specifically reference Alex Preddy at that time? Do you know for a fact that the officer was aware that the gun had been removed?
No, I don't know for a fact that the officer was aware that the gun had been removed.
That's the question. But that's the question.
But Jenna, it's your job as someone who thinks this is justified to explain that the officer didn't know that the gun had been removed.
I'm saying that it's reasonable, and it's your job as someone who's clearly saying that it wasn't justified to actually prove that, because if and when this ever got to trial, in our criminal justice system, the burden would actually be on you, not on me, to prove that it was not justified. The presumption here is that it is under the law.
Well, again, I think that is an extraordinary cultural and legal difference, that the police officers or the ICE agents who shot him would be considered would be having to argue that they did it legitimately, and it'd be my job to show that it was illegitimate by creating a fact that doesn't exist yet.
Well, it's not that the fact doesn't exist yet. It's that the facts haven't come out if and when this officer was ever charged with violating the law. And so under the U.S. Constitution, the burden is always on the plaintiff or the prosecutor or the person bringing charges alleging that this was unjustified to actually prove that, not the other person. Even if you and I got into a confrontation, right, and you were charged under American law, the burden would be on the prosecution, on the state, to show that you violated the law before your liberties would ever be infringed upon. And so that is a protection that absolutely applies to police officers as well and law enforcement.
So when Tom Homan says that improvements need to be made, what improvements would you insist upon?
Would I personally? I mean, I think that I trust Tom Homan to look at all of this and say, is there a way that we can hopefully try to see and identify some of these agitators before they even get up into the face of law enforcement? So, for example, my home state of Florida, where I reside, we passed something in I believe it's 2023. It might have been even earlier than that, called the HALO law for law enforcement. That means that if any citizen gets within a 25-foot radius of a police officer who tells them to stop and to back off, and they don't comply with the officer's instruction, immediately they are violating that law and subject to arrest. So that has led to many situations in Florida being quelled with these agitators before it gets to the point that Alex Preddy did.
Yes,
so
but
I think, of course,
if the person in the halo did not have a weapon on them, as this man did not, if the person in the halo did not have a weapon, he didn't. It had been removed, and the police officer decided to shoot the person dead. Do you think that, on the face of it, that would be justifiable?
That's a completely different set of facts, though, and you're presuming that the officer knew at the time that the gun had been removed. Now, if that fact is brought up in court and this officer said, yeah, I knew, and I decided to shoot him anyway, of course no one would say that that's justified. But under the facts and the circumstances, nothing that I've observed in the video would suggest that
Jenna,
it was unreasonable
sorry to go around this again, but you haven't proven that the officer didn't know that the gun had been removed.
You haven't proved that he didn't. And this is
you're
where
making a judgment
we're arguing
call.
Facts. And so are you. You're saying that this wasn't justified. And what I'm saying is that under American law, the presumption is that the officer acted reasonably by an objective and subjective standard. And so we use those in American law to ensure that the burden is not on the individual to have to justify what is reasonable under the circumstances. It's always the state or the prosecution's job, like you would be in this case.
That was genuinely chilling. And it's worth slowing down to recognize why. What you just heard isn't a one-off bad argument. It's a set of rhetorical moves that are increasingly being used to justify extreme state power, and once you spot them, you start seeing them everywhere. The first move is what you might call the luxury dismissal. The moment the host points out that the man was unarmed at the time force was used, the response isn't to address the fact, it's to attack the setting. You're saying this from a studio. You weren't there. The message is clear. Unless you're wearing a badge, you don't get to ask questions. Accountability becomes a privilege reserved for the powerful, not a right shared by the public. The second move is the halo trap. Bringing up Florida's so-called halo law sounds technical and reasonable until you think through the implications. It effectively creates a moving exclusion zone around authority, where proximity itself becomes a potential offense. Peaceful noncompliance, hesitation, even confusion can suddenly be reframed as justification for escalation. That's not about safety. That's about criminalizing closeness to power. But the most dangerous argument comes last, the burden of proof reversal. This is where the mask really slips. A trained constitutional lawyer knows that the foundation of a free society is the presumption of innocence. Yet here, that principle is quietly inverted. The assumption becomes that the officer acted correctly, and it's up to critics, or even the victim's family, to prove otherwise, not to question, not to scrutinize, but to disprove the state's use of force after the fact. That's not a debate about law and order. It's a vision of authority where compliance is expected, doubt is suspect, and accountability is optional. Dress it up in legal language, call it realism, call it security. The outcome is the same. Power first, questions later. So this is the question I want to leave you with. Is there any system that calls itself free where the default assumption is that state force is justified and the burden falls on ordinary people to prove it wasn't? Because if that's the direction things are heading, this isn't about one case or one argument anymore. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear them. And if you want more breakdowns like this, make sure you like and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.